Right. Well, welcome and thank you, Jo, for taking the time to talk to us today. You are our resident expert at the University of Liverpool on modern day slavery, and I wanted to explore what you're aware of, where we're going with it, and some context. So I'm Dr. Denise Preece. I sit in our work and organisational management. Jo, would you like to give your introduction?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Dr. Jo Meehan. I'm Senior Lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Denise, as I said, is in HR. I'm not. My role is research looking at supply chains. So slightly different perspective, but what we're finding with modern slavery is more and more supply chain professionals are having to work with HR professionals and legal too. They're starting to come together to work on this issue. So my research has been around modern slavery in corporate supply chains.
Thank you, Jo. So we'll start working through the slides that we have here. So Jo, we've discussed this earlier, and we've discussed this parity in how we record the numbers, but big numbers to start with. If we look at modern day slavery across the globe, there's a recording of roughly 25 million people, and that breaks down gender-wise into roughly 18 million women and girls and 7 million boys and men. So there's a sort of imbalance in gender, but there's that massive number.
Yeah, and the numbers are interesting in that we don't really have a true sense of what the scale is. Every organisation that works in modern slavery will have a different figure, and there's been lots of debate about, is it 40 million, is it 50 million? At the end of the day, there's an argument to say if it's one person, that's enough for us to act on it. So the idea of scale does give us an indication just how prevalent it is, but we should care because it's an awful practice. I see there, Denise, you put stuff about in the UK. Mm-hmm. And again, there are some real misperceptions around where modern slavery takes place. And people are often under the impression that it happens somewhere else in the world, a different organisation, a different sector. Couldn't possibly happen in the UK, or it couldn't possibly happen to our organisation. Firstly, it does. There's huge amounts of evidence that it's happening in the UK, not just in those criminal activities outside of corporate behaviour, but actually in corporate supply chains. And the other reason why that's important is that companies have supply chains. They don't just buy products in and make products, they buy them in globally. So everything that you can think of, from the food on our table to the computers on our desk, everything has a global supply chain. It's rare not to. We might not be aware of it, but it probably has a global footprint. So we need to be concerned about workers wherever they are.
Thanks, Jo. And going into some of the legal context, so I just wanted to frame where we're at legally, and this is specific context to the UK, so every other country will have its own legal framework. But if we go back to a definition in the first place, I picked up this one because I think it's quite helpful. Modern day slavery is being where one person controls another by exploiting a vulnerability.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of what we're generally looking at for modern slavery, we're generally looking at forced labour. So there are different types. So it does include things like prostitution and forced marriage. But in the business school environment, we tend not to look at that side of it. We're generally concerned with forced labour. And the legislation's actually an interesting area to think about, certainly from a HR perspective. Part of the problem is that we lack international legal clarity, not just on what it is, but who's responsible. So the UK bill covers UK companies, but we're operating in global supply chains. So how legally can we address some of the problems if it doesn't happen in our jurisdiction? So that can be problematic. The thing to point out about the definition there, it's about forced labour, but from an employment law point of view, very often these people who are exploited enter voluntarily into these conditions of exploitation, and they're contractual. So the fact that they're exploitative, that's where they're being misled. They think it's a genuine offer of employment, and some of the tactics that that are used against them is that they bring them to a particular job and then don't give them work for a couple of weeks. And within the whole job offer, they often displace people. So they take them out of their home area, again, to increase that vulnerability. They've not got the support network around them for this job that they're going to get. Put them up in accommodation, give them food, but charge them for that. And then by not having the work immediately, they're building up a debt. And that's where the exploitation happens. So contractually, from a HR and a legal perspective, it looks like they voluntarily entered a contract of employment. But when you start to unpick the details, you can see how the exploitation has manifested in that relationship.
And that's a really good point to pick up on, because if you look at the final paragraph there, the final point I've put, despite this, indications are that 70% of organisations expect to find modern day slavery in their operations or supply chain if they look for it. So out of every 4 companies, 3 companies are expecting it to be there. And that's why I wanted a definition in here to get us to start thinking about actually legally, how could this happen? How could this happen in 2020, 2030 with the legislation, the frameworks we have, and really what the frameworks are doing is helping us now understand our commitment to our people and our people within our, we'll talk about in our back garden, the people not just directly employed, but indirectly employed by us too. So why should we become concerned about this? It's now in a legislation. Okay, yes, larger organisations are the ones that have started to require it, but to be honest, the majority of stakeholders are looking for a commitment by a company to start exploring what is happening within each organisation. And to sit alongside that, we have our HR practitioner professional network, the CIPD, Chartered Institute of Personal Development, who have put it within their package of professional requirements for HR practitioners. So it's now becoming an obligation from a professional perspective, as well as there's a legal perspective, as well as there's this employment law perspective and how that's threading through.
Yeah, and indeed, and a lot of the research that we've been doing, Denise, is around what drives companies to do this. The biggest turning point has clearly been that legislation. But remember, the legislation only requires companies to publish a statement. And in that statement, they can say they're doing nothing about modern slavery. So the strength of that legislation is questionable, first of all. But we would say, as well as your legal obligation, we have a moral obligation too. Nobody goes to work wanting to exploit people or to feel that they're complicit in this crime. So we do have this moral imperative. Now that's harder for companies to get to. We can see the legal obligation. They're starting to see the reputational risk. Where we want them to get to is not doing it because there may be damage to their reputation. We want to do it because it's the right thing to do. Now that shifts the needle somewhat. And we know the legislation is quite weak. We know the enforcement is quite weak because we haven't really got the resources to police it. And it's quite difficult to police if somebody's voluntarily entered a contract, even though there's exploitation within it. So the best way, as Denise has put there, the best way to really tackle it is to not rely on when it happens prosecuting, it's for it to not happen in the first place. So how do we get to preventative methods of understanding the worker practices? So what are the different practices, and they're changing. So it's not one thing, it will be a multitude of different vulnerabilities and signals in the market that tell us that there's a possible risk here. And we just need to be a bit more attuned to some of those risks so we can make better, more proactive policy that helps us.
And that's where that final closing point I've made, it is actually preventable, isn't it, Jo? And do you want to talk around that a little bit?
Yeah, there will always be exploitation. I'm sure there's been exploitation of people for as long as, you know, records go back. There will always be a criminal element in the world. There will always be people who will use exploitation to their advantage. What we need to do as business professionals is make it impossible for them to do that in our corporate supply chains. So we need to build ways and policies that make it, at the moment, there's opportunity for criminals to traffic people or have forced labour deep in our supply chains because it's not being looked at. It's not being looked at robustly enough. There are holes in our system. There are problems with whose worker are we talking about? What is a worker? You've seen in the news all the stuff about Uber, you know, are they workers? Are they employees? Are they self-employed? Where we've got greyness in legislation, it's opportunities for exploitation. What we can do as business people is to, as well as the legislation, make sure our own policies and our own culture stamps this out. We will actively find it. It's not about finding it to manage our reputation. It's about finding it to make sure it doesn't happen. So it's a shift in emphasis that is needed. It's much more proactive. Thinking about how it might come about, understanding how our workers are treated and our subcontractors' workers are treated all the way around the world. And what do we do about it as a shared community? How do we pool our resources, pool our intelligence to try and understand the nitty-gritty of what's going on in them supply chains?
Thanks, Jo. So what I'm going to do is talk just generally around the 3 HR genres, just so we can just explore a little bit more a real data, real examples, real situations where it comes about. So I've talked about there's 3 genres running right now, 2020, 2030 in any organization. And we've got the extreme, the older generation human resource management, which wasn't really human resource management at all. It was more personnel administration. And that's the journey, if you like, HR practitioners are on. But that early 80s model was very focused around basically hire, fire, retire, and pay. It was administrative focused. Okay. And right now, many organizations still have that model. So let's not forget that. And that's why I've put that extra line there, where the typical organization that might sit in that type of genre is low skill, no skill, manual, menial, and repetitive type labor, low automation. And usually the type of contracts we would see people on there are very much the gig economy, transient labor, short-term, self-employed. They would be sat in that grouping of that genre. The next genre is the more typical noughties model, which was when HR changed its name to HR, which was this very much seeing humans as resources. So they were there to maximize, they were there to become more efficient, they were there to become more effective, to make their contribution, if you like. They are a resource to a company in that way. And what we were doing was very much pushing without pulling. We weren't actually seeing this symbiotic relationship of an employee-employer. We saw it almost as a one-way push down. And then we moved to this the 2020, 2030, this contemporary where we are today. And this again, we see quite different ways of working in this. So you might get different types of contract in here, but the relationship, how we see each other, is much more as citizens and a symbiotic relationship. So happy people, happy organizations, happy stakeholders would be typical of this type of genre of human resource, and more people. It's more around people management, how we look at people and our relationship with people.
And you can start to see, if we think about those particular classifications, as you said, you can see where some of the risks are. So that first one is just a lack of data, a lack of intelligence. It's very operational. So where you have got transient labour, if paperwork is in a desk and it's not computerized, those subtle signals and those patterns that might give us the clues that something's going on are lost in those organizations. And as Denise says, even if your company's not like that, your suppliers might be, your subcontractors might be. Human resources is for me really, really problematic for modern slavery, because we take the people out of our decisions. They are resources. It's about efficiencies and resources. And it was in that sort of era where we saw this huge shift in markets towards cost leadership, low prices, efficiencies, taking cost out, and outsourcing anything that we could do to get low cost. And the hangover from that, even if companies have improved their practices, there's a legacy impact here in that they're probably still competing on cost efficiencies. Cost efficiencies push down prices, but with outsourced models, responsibilities pushed away, and that's where people are ripe for exploitation. We don't see them, we don't talk about people, we talk about supply chains of products rather than workers. Once we start to move into people partners, for me, this is less about human resource, it's more about human responsibility. And responsibility starts to come through that partner model. You're responsible for something, you're responsible for other people. And that responsibility, what we're seeing with modern slavery, is as well as being responsible for the boundaries of your organisation and the workers in your company, increasingly, and in line with the legislation, we are just as accountable and responsible for other workers in our supply chain. We don't employ them, but we still have a responsibility to them. And some of that is about looking at us. So we might have really good policies, really good practices with our own people. We treat our staff well. We have all the support mechanisms in place, but we're still operating on really, really small margins, operating on cost. And that still, for me, is problematic, that in that very competitive, low-cost way of operating, even if we have the partner model, we're still potentially increasing the risks of slavery or other exploitation or vulnerable work.
And it is interesting there, because it's almost, if it looks too good to be true, it is too good to be true when it comes to cost in that supply chain. And this is where we need to think about people. And this is why, that last genre, those organizations tend to be absolutely passionate about doing the right thing. And they're getting their own house in order. But that's their tier one, that's their own, if you like, they're taking their own people as citizens, but they're not seeing the wider citizenship. And that's why I've put that not in my backyard. It's like, how big is your backyard?
Yeah, but it's a great place to start. It's good that they're doing something. And what we're seeing with the companies who are taking it seriously, they do look at their own backyard first. They make sure their workers are looked after. They make sure their sites are secure. They've got the security. But still, one of the things that I'm seeing is this tension between HR and other parts of the organisation. And there's a tension between HR and supply chain. So supply chain, and I'm from this background, we still talk about supply chains of products. We've dehumanized it in some way. And Our data is brilliant. We've got the most intelligent systems. We can know within, you know, a 200-meter radius where any of our products are and where our trucks are. You know, look at the apps that you get for where your deliveries are. You can track everything. But do we know anything about the people that made those products? About their conditions, about their life, about how they've been treated? No, we don't think about the workers that make those products that we go, the people that extract things from the ground, that go into our buildings, whether it's cement or stone, and we don't see that, and we don't ask questions. And that's where we need to pull on this partner model. Well, how do we treat our own staff? And how do we take that learning and build that into our supply chain? So supply chain people need to learn from HR people. We need to understand, how do we humanize not just our workforce, but our supply chain? How do we put the people back into our decision making?
I think you raised a really interesting point there, Jo, because we always called HR human resources. If we started calling it human responsibility, which is this is why I changed the module from calling it human resource, an introduction to human resource, contemporary human resource, to people management, to put the people back and remove the resource out and bring the human side to the relationship.
And for me, my research is all about responsible business. That's what I study. And I think the responsibility and accountability needs to be brought into the debate. So responsible for who, responsible for what, and how do we hold them to account? If we know the legislation's quite weak and is probably not going to hold us to account enough, we need to have that moral obligation. And we've been doing some work around boundaries of care. So we've been looking at and these are really good organisations. They're doing really good stuff around looking after their workforces and training people about modern slavery. They're doing the right things, but they're only training their own people. And for us, it's like they've got this artificial boundary about, well, we know we haven't got it in our company. Well, what about your supply chain? So it's lifting our gaze and taking that learning of, that was a really good thing to do. How do we extend it? Because we work in these ecosystems, where we work in this wider environment. And if everybody did that, because it's not just you as a company doing that, if all companies started to lift their gaze and work together, that's when we can start to share intelligence. And we share the same suppliers, we share the same pressures, we share the same vulnerabilities too. So it's a slightly different, much more collaborative model, which is difficult because we work in competitive markets. Are we going to collaborate, with our competitors? Well, we do. So construction is a really good example. Construction sector is very, very competitive. It's very low margins. It's got high risk of modern slavery because it's transient labour. A lot of it is low skill. So workers can come in, they do a job, and even if people start to go, that doesn't look quite right, they've moved on. So we get this transient workforce, lots of risk in construction. And the construction sector in the UK have joined forces, and they've set up the sustainability school. And they work together, they share intelligence around modern slavery and some other wider social issues too around sustainability. And they share their resource. And that's enabled them to take great strides in terms of tackling modern slavery, because the first step is understanding it and understanding where it might be. So that working together is really this extension of this partner model.
And how does that school come about, Jo? If it's in construction, how was that established? And
it was because the reason it came about was, one, that there was a genuine desire to do something because they recognised they were a very at-risk sector. So many of the few legislative things that had come out had been in that sector. So where we had instances, it had been in construction. And part of the issue was that no one company had the resources to do it on their own. And they realised that they only saw a small part of their supply chain, and they didn't know what it was. It was a new emerging area, and the only way to do it was to share resource. So they set this school up, and all the construction companies generally work together on these issues because they share suppliers. So if it's happening in one company's supply chain, you can bet that all those other companies have got it too. And there's a genuine desire to root it out. But not one company knows how to do it. So they share that resource.
That's really, really, really interesting. So what I was going to move on to next is, and it comes back to what you've just started approaching into, is this collaboration. And that's come about by some of these commonalities that were starting to be observed, wasn't it? So I've tried to group them, which helps people, practitioners, start thinking about, well, actually, is this part of our business? And some of that is this low skill, no skill. Some of it is manual, menial, repetitive type labour, and the sort of low, no automation. That would be the quite typical, and that's why I try to link it back, if you think about it, the genres of this.
Yeah, and these commonalities are important because they're a different way of thinking about modern slavery risk. So if we look back at the early work that framed the 2015 Act, and if we look at the Act itself and all the government guidance that's come out from there, and guidance from other companies too, other organisations, what they tend to focus on, again, it's about products and geographies rather than people. And this has always been my problem with some of that guidance. So they will say, we know these high-risk countries. So we've got Vietnam, China, Iran. There's a whole list of high-risk geographies where we know that slavery is prevalent. And we also have high-risk categories. So they're sectors or industries. So food, construction, fashion, materials aggregates that come out of the ground, mining, that type of thing, agriculture. So we know we've got sectors, types of things we buy, and we've got places. Now, for me, what's missing in that is people. So what we've seen happen is when we've been working with companies about modern slavery, they go, well, we don't buy fish and we don't source from Vietnam, therefore we haven't got a problem. And they can convince themselves that modern slavery couldn't happen there in their supply chains because they don't buy those types of stuff and they don't buy from those places. But we know it's not just a place issue. It happens in the UK, it happens all over the world, and it's not just about certain sectors. It might be more prevalent in some sectors, but for me, it's about, if you put the people at the centre of your decision making, you start to understand the problem more. So rather than saying, well, it's in Vietnam and it's in fashion, if you start to say, well, actually, it's anything that's got low skill or is transient labour, so they come onto site and then they leave the site, so they're not here for any long time, where there's brokers and employment agencies rather than direct trades, where they can quickly get people in, get them to do a job and move off. It's not this, they've got to go to college for 2 years and get a qualification. It's types of labour. And if we think about it from the perspective of the people, we start to see risk in a very different way. And we start to say, God, that actually in our operations, there's loads of jobs like that. It's not just fashion, it's not just sourcing from Bangladesh. Actually, a whole host of other areas where we can be exploited start to come about. And that's where we can be a bit more preventative. So how do we prevent some of these things? Do we put in extra layers of safeguarding in some of these areas to try to prevent some of the exploitation?
And this is where I started my sort of big journey into it, really, because I started this from a HR perspective probably 3-5 years ago, sort of similar time, and we started looking similar to you, about the sort of the throwaway. As soon as anything becomes throwaway, it means usually you're driving costs down. It means that you'll meet this type of issue. So this is why I was trying to look at the commonalities from a people management perspective. We might be, if we need to prioritize our plan, how do we do that? Well, this is where I sort of come with well, actually, if we, like we've just said, the low skill, no skill, and that moves into the limited life choices, and especially if you start thinking about, right, so it's no skill, low skill, or repetitive, limited life choices, and we've moved them into, we know that in our supply chain there's people who are being housed in X. That starts increasing vulnerability, along with the middleman, the recruiter, the gangmaster. We've also got the accommodation, the lifestyles, and lack of choices. So that's the whole limited life choices. And this is where you and I have talked about this notion of indebtedness, entrapment. How does it end up there? Because people quite often do not recognize themselves as being.
Absolutely. And people who are victims of this don't see themselves, and the terminology itself is quite problematic. So when people have come forward who have been exploited, as soon as you say the word slave or slavery, because it's got so many historic, really negative connotations, people either don't see themselves as that or don't want to be seen like that. Because sometimes using the word slavery or vulnerable actually in and of itself is another form almost of abuse of people, because you're labeling them, you're saying that. So the whole language needs to change. I don't think we yet know what the correct language should be, and how to phrase this, and how to tackle it in a different way. And we've looked at things like the spectrum of vulnerable work. But even that word, saying somebody's vulnerable, is making a judgment sometimes of those people. So we need to be really conscious that we're not exacerbating these people's problems just through by using the wrong language. So there's an awful lot of research going on, not by myself, but by lots of other people, to try and think about the images we use in our training. If we're using very outdated images, they can be offensive. They can give out the wrong signals. They give out certain stereotypes. So things like indebtedness and entrapment comes in so many different forms. We need to be much cleverer at understanding where some of these vulnerabilities and dependencies stem from, and how we can solve them.
And that leads me on to the whole situation where we are with people management right now, in that we have such a bright future when we look at HR analytics. So on one hand, we've got HR analytics, brand new world, so much data, many of it not, and much of this data not used, or not used to the benefit of other, often used just to record activity efficiency. And so we're holding a data set that we could spot this by patterns, and looking at the data more through a microscope. We've talked about in the past, you look at who gets paid, what address, do they all live at the same address, is someone sharing bank accounts, why would that be? There's lots of different data sets you hold that you can analyze, and you can ask your partners in your supply chain to analyze or support them in that metric analysis, because some organizations are much more progressive in HR analytics.
Absolutely. And it's about being responsive too. So one of the things that we're seeing in our research is people think it's this fixed thing. So this is what modern slavery is, and these are the mechanisms. So that idea of taking people on, charging them for accommodation, underworking them so they build up debt, and then they're indebted because they never pay that debt off. That's one model. And using the same bank accounts is another sign. And as we start to close down those routes, as we understand more of it, new vulnerable working conditions will emerge. And what we're seeing from the research is we're training companies and they'll go, oh, right, so it looks like that then. So that's what they look for. And if they don't see that, they're blind to all these other possible signals. Or they'll go, right, that's what it looks like. We can deal with that. And then the criminals move on to a different thing. So we're still looking here and the criminals are one step ahead. So we need to be, rather than just following the problem and tracking the problem, we need to be much more proactive in leading an agenda. So there's no space for it here. So you can be one step ahead, but we're already 2 steps ahead of you. So we're proactively making it a less attractive place to exploit people. That's where we expect it.
Yeah, and this is where, so we're linking the evidence-based HR comes into this. So we have one part of HR is now expanding its understanding of data analysis, data collection, and how we use data. The other is evidence-based HR. So how do we make our decisions and what type of evidence do we use? And I think we are as a practice transitioning from this old HR noughties model, which is chasing costs, looking at the cost to people that's introduced while we've been doing that practice.
And it's funny when you talk about the classifications of HR and how it's developed and developing. Purchasing, supply chain has almost followed that same trajectory. And I often think that those two functions are very similar. They're both sort of support functions, but that underplays just what we do. We are the supply chains, and the people are just such critical function in terms of being responsible businesses, but a little bit under the surface somehow. And that same progression that you've seen in HR, we have in purchasing, supply chain. We had that very administrative model, then we went to like full-on commercial efficiencies. That it improved our standing in an organisation, but had all these other negative spillover effects around dehumanisation, about it all just being about cost. And now we're coming out of that. And again, we're using analytics too to try and put intelligence back into our supply chain, and responsibility and accountability, and rehumanising, and asking better decisions, so we've got sustainable supply chains rather than just super efficient supply chains. So that the two, I think, are working very much in parallel, and I think that's why we've got a real opportunity to do something that is cross-functional and that starts to tackle some of these issues in a much more proactive way.
And it is interesting because for a while HR was held up as they were the true north compass, so they should have been independent from the decision making that was going on, to hold up the compass, the moral compass.
Yeah.
And over time that moved away from where is true north, that independence of decision making, and now it's coming back to say actually that moral compass is so important that actually it can't just be held by HR. It has to be held by every person making a decision.
Absolutely.
Throughout our organisation, and this is where we sort of start linking it and making sense of this is actually multifaceted. It's very complex, and then that comes back to why do we get educated people into organisations? Well, supposedly because they can actually manage complexity. That's why they can see and hold multiple versions of one truth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we're all on a journey. Every single organisation will always and need to be on a journey. And I think what I'm finding is that the more I read about it is, instead of actually running after someone who's wrong and chastising them and punishing them, it's actually bringing them on board and saying, well, actually, it's good that you found something, because the whole thing about learning is we learn more from our mistakes usually than we do from our successes. So if we've made a mistake, we need to hold our hands up and say, do you know what? It's happening. It just does.
That does require a culture shift where you are allowed to make mistakes. And there's still a lot of companies who don't want to look for modern slavery because they're afraid they'll find it. And then what? Then what do we do about it?
But I would suggest,
I was going to say, suppliers.
You must work with them now, Jo, that you know, that statistic of we're expecting 3 out of every 4 companies to have it becomes normal rather than not, which is a language then that they can tolerate, or are you not finding that?
There's a real reticence to look in their supply chains for it. So what they'll tend to do is contractually try and manage it away. So they will push responsibility. So we've just published our paper about this. So I'll send you the link if anybody wants to read it. But they use ambiguity. So they'll say, we're doing all this shiny stuff. Look at all this shiny stuff happening here. And contractually, then they push the responsibility down to their supplier and say, it's your responsibility to manage your supply chain. And then that next one will go, yeah, we'll push that one down to you. And it just pushes it down the road. But the problem there is that we're pushing it to lower and lower tiers in our supply chain, or higher, depending which way you go. And those suppliers probably have less resources than you do to manage it. So do you think it's going to get prioritized? No, it might just get hidden. It might get hidden more. And hopefully then, if nobody's going to ask questions, we'll take that contractual risk because no one's ever going to ask us about it anyway. So we're pushing it down. And the other thing that happens by contractually managing it and pushing it, you know, down the road to making it somebody else's responsibility, it makes it harder to spot it. It also means nothing changes. So does that help somebody who's in a situation of exploitation? No, because there's no real action. And it just, it creates this system where no one's asking the right questions. So at the heart of this problem might be that our business models are unsustainable. So if we're a construction company and we're operating on single-digit profit margins, that's probably unsustainable. But that's what we're doing because that's what everybody else is. And just by pushing it down the road, nobody's going, why have we got modern slavery in our supply chains? Is it because there's not enough value in it that everybody's making shortcuts and it gets to a point where there's going to be some exploitation somewhere? So by embracing it and working with our supply chain, we can hopefully get to a point at some point where we have an honest conversation that, you know what, a 5% profit margin, when we're talking about, you know, these really complex projects where lots of things go wrong, there's lots of unknowns, is unsustainable. If we paid our workers properly and paid our suppliers properly, we would build in cost that allows us to do it properly. So just as an example, just conscious of the time, one of the things that we were proposing for Liverpool was that there's lots of new money coming into Liverpool for new construction projects. And we want Liverpool to be a beacon of this is how we can do it in a fair, equitable, responsible way. So this is how we could manage making sure our buildings are slavery free. So you've seen lots of stuff in the news around the world where buildings are being pulled down, renamed because they've had historic slavery associated with them. What I don't want to be in 20 years time, my grandchildren saying, oh, you were involved in that project, we're pulling that building down because it had slavery in it. I don't want to be associated with that, and I don't want my children and grandchildren to be associated with that. So we need to get it right now, so we're not building that legacy up. And we're working on a proposal at the moment, so we are working with Liverpool City Region to say, what would slavery-free construction look like in Liverpool? And that's not to say we only look at workers in Liverpool. We have to look at the global supply chain. And one of the consequences of that, because it costs a lot of money to do this work, to really proactively ensure there's no modern slavery takes a lot of resource. We don't understand it, we don't know where it is, so we need to commit a lot of resource to it. What we were saying, you might find you don't get 10 buildings. If you cost them properly, so everybody gets a fair value share and everyone can fairly pay their workers, instead of 10 buildings, you might get 5 or you might get 6. And instead of being able to make those buildings in 12 months, to properly do due diligence on that, it might be it takes you 2 years. But that's your trade-off. You get less, it might take you longer, but wouldn't that be great to know that we had guaranteed slavery-free, vulnerable worker-free, full supply chains end to end, that our legacy is that people can be proud of that. We did the right thing. That to me is what the future is. And that requires a very big shift from where we are now. So at the moment, we're doing there's lots of good work going on. For me, it's still playing around the edges a bit too much. We need to sort of have a bit of courage and take that leap of faith and to really commit to something. And that requires HR, supply chain, legal, everybody working together to really tackle it properly.
And I think just to summarize it, that's where this whole modern slavery, for me, the iceberg notion of an iceberg comes into Absolutely. It is, you know, actually we can bring this iceberg up, we can float it to the surface. We need strategies and different things to do it. You're talking about different sectors are approaching it in sector specific, which is absolutely fantastic news to hear. And we can replicate that. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We can actually look at other areas that have done it very well. And I know you've looked at a few case studies over time. And this is why, you know, we talk about, I put there propensity. It's known, it's also unknown.
It's unknown, yeah. And I think the iceberg is a great analogy. Yeah, at the moment, we're also possibly looking in the wrong place. So are we finding it? Not really. Well, we know it happens. We know we've got all these hotlines where people report, we know it happens, so why aren't we finding it? And it's probably because we're looking in the wrong places. And that's because we've been told it happens in these places, in these sectors. And actually, it's far more prevalent than we think. That's why we need to shift our focus to thinking about the people rather than just places and things. We need to humanize our decision making. And as soon as we do that, that iceberg will start to come up. We'll see more of it. But that brings its own risks. What do you do? How do you help these people? How do you stop it? How do you educate? And that's where we need a much more collaborative approach, because it'd be very difficult for one company to sort it out.
Yeah. And like you say, if you're doing a regional footprint, then there is more money in the system. There is more impetus and more passion. So going on, I've done the sort of case study research. We've talked about it, and we may do a different separate recordings, Jo. But you know, we've looked at in the mineral supply chain. You know, so this is where we've talked, and the aggregates, the things that are coming out of the earth. It's in the food supply chains, fashion. You know, tech is a massive one, massive issue.
They estimate, you know, cobalt is something that comes out the ground. It's a finite resource, mined in the DRC, and it's heavy with child labour and slavery. And there are real political issues in that region too. There's some battles between China and America too to try and get control of some of these mines. There's lots of geopolitical wrangling that people are getting caught up in, that murkiness. But cobalt goes into batteries. So, you know, one of the arguments is that anything with a battery has probably got some labour issues in it, either child labour or some exploitative, unsafe labour. Think about what we use batteries for, as well as our laptops and our computers, electric cars. We're pushing this move to electric vehicles. So that's great for the environment, but possibly rising our vulnerable labour too. So we've got these real tensions and dilemmas. If it was really easy to solve, we would have done it already. The fact is, it's really difficult. They are knotty, they're complex. We're dealing with different regions, with again with these like geopolitical issues, that we can't just pull out of these areas because that can be damaging too. So how do we engage them differently to ensure they get an equal value share? How do we even know where to look?
But it is interesting, Jo, because that's where they started with the environment. You know, the environment was never an issue. And then all of a sudden, big movement. And then they started putting certain measures. Then they looked at national measures, regional measures, global measures, you know, and this is probably going to be the same thing.
We get these tipping points that, you know, called tipping points, on it. All of a sudden, something gets the attention. And for me, there was a turning point in the environment when it stopped being. We used to talk. I remember being doing lots of environmental research years ago, and people were talking about fishing, and people just weren't getting excited about fish. They're like, well, it's fish. The world's getting a bit warm, whatever. And people were just so blasé about it. As soon as we started talking about different types of environmental damage, whether it was flooding, or people go, oh, actually that affects me. So it's how do we get people to care? Another big turning point from the environment was David Attenborough. You know, he had a huge impact in mainstreaming the problem and the issue and getting people talking. And we need similar things to happen with slavery and other forms of vulnerable work too. And at some point there will be a tipping point, and we will find that thing or things that start to get people to care, to get that moral imperative. But at the moment, the whole system in which businesses operate is not really conducive to, doesn't reward enough responsible business. And I know that's a niche market for some companies, and that's what their whole competitive advantage is built on, but it's not mainstreamed enough. It's seen as something we might get an advantage from rather than the baseline. So they're order winners rather than order qualifiers. That should be the baseline. And we're so far away from that. So far away from that.
It does make you realise that really this needs to, you know, instead of manufacturers, consumers talking about it, it needs to also go into the education system much lower down, much earlier on. You know, the same as they talk about the environment, they need to talk about the people.
And the role of consumers is really interesting, because there is pressure to say, well, companies are putting statements on their websites, the choice should be with consumers. And I get the argument that yes, we do have some agency in that, we can make choices, but not always. We often don't have enough information. And I think it's this another form of this ambiguity where companies can say, well, we've made our statements, down to you consumers to decide, do you want to use us? And I don't think we should be putting that with its opaqueness onto consumers, because we don't know. We only know what we've been told, and we don't necessarily know what to look for. And I don't think it should be down to consumers to make that choice. And I had a really interesting conversation with somebody in the House of Lords, who's Baroness Lola Young. She's amazing. She's fighting for worker rights and doing an awful lot of work around modern slavery in the House of Lords. And we were talking about this role of consumers, and how we as consumers can drive companies to be more responsible. There is a little bit of that. And her point was really interesting. Again, it was about construction. So we might have choice in terms of where we buy our clothes from. So do we go to these very cheap manufacturing companies where we know there's been exploitation problems in the past? Do we go to a higher company that trades on ethical things? That's fine when you're a consumer and you have choice. But one of the examples we have there is about stone and aggregates and the things that make up our building. So if you're living in Liverpool and your council, your public procurement, decide to reflag your road because it needs repairs, and they choose stone that has modern slavery embedded into it, might be far down the supply chain, but there's exploitation in that product. Your council relays you all around your house with this nice new stone. Who's the consumer? if that's outside you've got no, you can't just move house and go, well, I can't live here anymore. So there's all these other systemic things around us, whether that's public procurement or organisations, that we just don't see. Companies can clean up their supply chains for the products they sell to us, yet still their buildings might have, be constructed with vulnerable workers in them. So
it's interesting, Jo. We do have to start from somewhere. And when you actually think about other what's brought major change, I'll give you an example from a HR perspective. When we had to publish gender as one of the reporting aspects, so historically you always just reported your financial accounts, your profit, your loss, and then all of a sudden we had to report on top of those things the gender balance and the gender pay gap. Miraculously, within years, that's reduced, and they say it will reduce. And I wonder whether there is something about modern day slavery and reporting on that as a standard, and contracts that are going through that they need to have evidence that that's been removed. Then all of a sudden
there is, but the problem that we have with modern slavery. So yes, we've seen it's definitely, the legislation has definitely put it on the agenda, and absolutely, should we be doing more of it? Absolutely we should. Is there a role for public policy? Absolutely. Is there a role for legislation? Absolutely. These things force some companies to talk about it. The problem we have with supply chain legislation is, how on earth do you enforce that? Because if you look at things like the gender pay gap and some of the HR legislation, why has that changed behaviours? It changed behaviours because they are in control of it to some degree. They are bounded by their organisation. So as an organisation, you report what your organisation does, and you can change your policies, you can employ more women, you can pay them more, you can balance up that diversity mix, you can do all that to largely in your control. The difference with supply chain modern slavery legislation is you can clean up, goes back to your not in my backyard, you can clean up your organisation. You can make sure your sites are secure, that all your employment contracts are fair. You can do all that, union representation. The issue isn't necessarily in your company. The issue is in your supply chain. And that's not just the supplier that you deal with. That's your supplier's supplier and their supplier. Your supply chain might be 8 tiers deep with subcontracted work within it. It's such an expansive network. Trying to legislate for that is a legal nightmare, because while you can be responsible for the bounds of your company, it's much harder to control the bounds of your supply chain. Most companies don't even know who is in their supply chain. They know who their first tier suppliers are. Do they know where their suppliers get their materials from and subcontract? No.
So, from a HR perspective, though, what was the transformation for the gender equality? It was always enacted, it was always in law, there was always policies. The change came about from transparency.
Yeah.
Publishing and transparency. Because once it becomes transparent and it's accessible to the general public, your consumer, then consumers can start making decisions. They can start making noise if that's not, they choose to invest. Investors were looking at green investments, at responsible investments, and that's money drives money. Once you open it up and you make it more transparent, that's been the sizable shift.
And transparency is the actual Section 54 guidelines for modern slavery reporting is transparency in supply chains. The whole thing is hooked around transparency. The problem with transparency is, again, we don't have transparency in our supply chains. We know we've got transparency of product. We know where all our products are. We can track them around the world. What we don't have transparency on is the workers that made those products. We don't see that because that's not reported anywhere. Then when companies have tried to report workers, this is where that whole Uber argument comes in. They report their direct employees. the self-employed, the limited companies, the contractors, they're not classed as their staff, so they don't report them. And that's likely where the issue is. So there's all these mechanisms and this fuzziness and just the sheer size of our supply chains. So most companies have got so many more suppliers than they have employees, and that's just first tier suppliers, not counting their supply chains through to raw materials. It is a massive mammoth task. So even though we've got transparency, we can only be transparent about what we've got data on, and we don't have the data because none of this is captured in data. And I don't think it's feasible to it ever be done just because of the sheer size of it. So for me, what needs to change are some of the structures. So supply chains are too complex, they're too long, too much outsourcing, which is about outsourcing accountability in many, many ways. And we need to get companies to start thinking about the shape, the structure, and the responsibility of those structures and how we can make them manageable. We can maybe start to do it. But we've also got companies that are so big. You know, you look at the likes of Amazon, where would you even start mapping their supply chain? It's just another level of big. And that's just their direct suppliers. We are never going to be able to account for all of those companies and those companies' supply chains and subcontractors. So the legislation hangs off transparency, but we don't know enough yet about transparency and how it works in a supply chain context. We're hanging it all off that. But you talked about evidence-based research. At the moment, we've got lots of evidence about transparency of products. We've got very, very little evidence that shows transparency of workers in supply chains and its transformative effect. The evidence isn't there.
Well, we'll close on that because that becomes it steps into a whole new area. But I ultimately, are you optimistic?
I am, despite all my negative cynicism and we need to change the system. I am, and the more I work with companies, the more optimistic I'm getting that it's on the agenda. And I think we've got some amazing people working in businesses. I think our students who are going to be the leaders of the future have got a very, very different mindset than our generation. I think they're much more attuned to it. I think they're asking better questions than we ever did. So I think there will be a shift, but I do think it's not going to be within the bounds of how we work now. I think to try and address some of these more systemic issues and systemic bias and exploitation, the whole system needs a jolt and needs to change. And the way we're going now with heavily concentrated markets, big business, I don't think that is conducive to managing modern slavery. So I think we need much more diversity in our business models. I think we'll get there. And I think there'll be something that happens. A company sets out a very different agenda for how they're going to do it. And I think it will be a bit of a domino effect that people go, that's it. But I don't think it will be in the frame of how we're thinking about businesses at the moment. Because the way it's going now, we're just narrowing our view rather than expanding our view. But yes, I am optimistic, and I'm going to keep banging the drum till we sort it.
Jo, thank you so much for your time. We really, really do appreciate it. It's lovely to hear of a different lens on an issue that we're all trying to grapple in business. So your time is so valuable to us, and your thoughts and insights. And I'll find a link.
My pleasure.
Find a link for some of your work as well if you share that.
Yeah, I'll send you some of the work through. And there's an awful lot on the internet as well. There's some brilliant companies and NGOs and charities and even the government guidance on what they're trying to do. But the more brains that are thinking about it, the better. So get involved, do your bit, ask the right questions, and keep on asking those questions. And eventually we will get it sorted. I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Jo.
Okay, thank you.